Devarim, asher deber Moshe el kol Yisrael b'yever hayarden, b'midbar bo'arava, mosuf ben paran uven tofel, v'lavan v'chatzeros v'dizahav, achad asar yom, mechorev derech har seir ad kodesh barneya.
Our weekly parasha is called Devarim. It starts the new book, the last book of the Pentateuch of Moses, in English called Deuteronomy. However, this is a Greek word which means the second law. I don't think this is a good name for that book, or often it's called the repetition of the law. The book doesn't repeat any law except 10 commandments. This is why in Hebrew language there is no notion of the second law there, and the book is called Devarim, which means the words, and that's the beginning of the today's weekly Torah portion. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel across the wilderness in the Arabah opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel and Laban and Hazeroth and Dijahab. This is the time when Israel is ready to enter the land of the Canaan. These are the last days of the life of Moses, who is not even going there. But Moses is instructed by God to give these words to the new generation, the people whom, many of whom hardly even seen the Exodus. And that's why the book is written. This is one single sermon of Moses. It's his last sermon, his last address to the new generation of Israel. Moses has already ordained the new leader that will replace him after his departure, Joshua ben Nun. And Moses wants to talk to the people of Israel for the last time. The book itself, this address, has two parts, two distinct parts. The narrative part, which basically will include three Torah portions, Devarim, Vayetchanan, and Ekev, and it will go from Deuteronomy 1 till the end of chapter 11. And the legal part, which will include many ethical laws and legislation, particularly pertaining to the life in the new land. This is why I am hesitant to call this book a second law, because this is an additional law. The scholars call this law the Deuteronomical law, or Deuteronomical law code, and some of them even believe that this law code was written much later in 600s BCE. I happen to disagree with that position, and when we will study the laws themselves, we will see how they are well connected and well balanced together with the laws of Shoftim and the Parashat Shoftim or Mishpatim and the Levitical Code of Holiness. In the narrative part has three Torah portions, and mainly these Torah portions, these chapters, they are about the admonition of Israel. They are about reminding Israel about its problems and about how God was leading Israel throughout this 40 years. And they are not written in a chronological order. In fact, the Parashat Devarim doesn't deal with any Exodus issues or any of these stories. It deals with a story which happened at the Kadesh Varni. It deals with a story that actually explains to the generation why the people of Israel are still in that land of nomadic life. Why haven't they entered the land that God has given and has promised to Moses? That's the explanation. It is interesting that Jewish people read these chapters of Deuteronomy right before a very sad day. It's the day this day is called the 9th of Ab. On that day, at 9th of Ab, 586 BCE, the temple of which Solomon built in Jerusalem was destroyed. On the same 9th of Ab, at 70 AD, or CE, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by Romans again. This is why the day of the 9th of Ab, it's the sad day. It's the day of fasting and praying. And of course, there are two things happening on that day. In the synagogues, the book of Lamentation is read. And also there is a prayer for the forgiveness and for the restoration of the temple. And also before the 9th of Ab, the Haftarah pattern changes. The Haftarah pattern is now related to the events of the 9th of Ab, and the three Haftarot are called the Haftarot of rebuke. And they're taken from the book of Isaiah and the book of Jeremiah. In fact, last Haftarah already was the Haftarah of rebuke from the book of Jeremiah chapter 2. And the harsh words God is speaking to the people of Israel by the prophet Jeremiah, who actually is living through the siege of Jerusalem and seeing his words come into being. And the Haftarah to the Parashat Devarim comes from the book of Isaiah. And Isaiah lives, of course, over 100 years before the destruction of the temple. But he brings the rebuke to the nation of Israel with the very harsh words. This is very interesting because generally, the rabbis are very, very careful to justify any actions that Israelites could have made wrong. And as we talked about this in the previous chapters, when we looked at the rabbinic commentaries, the reason for such a position is a defense against the unjust Jewish-Christian polemics, where the Christian apologets of the early ages try to argue the fact that God has forsaken Israel based on their misdeeds during the Exodus. Not at this time. The time of 9th of Ab is the time when Israel is supposed to search their souls. And particularly Midrashim, which are the compilations of the rabbinic sermons, and particularly there is a Midrash, Eika Rabbah, which is on the book of Lamentations, that collects all the sermons of the rabbis and quotation from the earlier rabbis about the story of the destruction of the temple. These are much more critical about Israel. They contain lots of self-searching of the souls. They contain the analysis of what has happened and the recognition of the fact that Israel has gone into idolatry. And this is why the Deuteronomy 1 is the reading of the parasha coincides with the beginning of these weeks that lead to the 9th of Ab. In rabbinic tradition, the Parashat Shalach, the people who were sent to spy out the land, came back with their report on the 8th of Ab. The way how rabbis calculate it is interesting. If we noticed in the book of Numbers, they have in chapter 13, they have the celebration of, actually in chapter 11, they celebrate the Passover. And then when it talks about the celebration of Passover, they said that there will be a Passover for those who are unclean. So Passover comes on the 14th of Nisan, and the postponed Passover comes months later on the 14th of Iyar. And then, of course, we have a period of time where Miriam was sick with leprosy, and she was sick with leprosy for 7 days. So adding this period of time, plus the 40 days when the spies came back from scouting the land, it all adds up to the 8th of Ab. And on the 9th of Ab, on the morning, Israelites disobey God and attempt to attack the Canaanites. So what we see is a combination of 3 tragic events in the history of Israel. The event of Kadesh Barnea that prevented the people of Israel to enter the land on time, then the destruction of the temple, and then the destruction of the second temple. And so these words of rebuke, when God speaks to the people of Israel, in the book of Exodus, in the book of Deuteronomy, first chapter, verse 32, it says, "But for all this you did not trust the Lord of God, who goes before you in your way, to seek out the place for you, to encamp in the fire by night and cloud by day, to show you the way in which you should go." This is the example of self-critique that is existent in Judaism and self-analysis of what was happening. But the real reason for this self-analysis of the history of Kadesh Barnea and the destruction of the first temple is to attempt to understand what actually was going on during the second temple destruction. What was the reason for it? Because this is the most unclear things. And Talmud and rabbinic tradition dedicates lots of discussions to what actually has happened, what went wrong. And that's why some of the attempt is to draw the analogy from the first temple. And this is why for the Haftarah, there is a suggestion to read Isaiah chapter 1. And in Isaiah chapter 1, we have a very interesting passage here. Isaiah chapter 1. Verses 15, verses 12 through 15. It says, "When you come to appear before me, who requires of you trampling of my courts? Bring your worthless offering no longer. Incense is an abomination to me. New moon and Sabbath, the calling of the assemblies. I cannot endure iniquity and solemn assembly." This is a very interesting passage. It says, "I hate your moon festivals and your appointed feasts." In other words, they have become burden to me. I am weary on them. What is happening here? It appears in Isaiah that God is actually rejecting what his people are doing, attempt to keep his commandments. In the book of Deuteronomy, it says, all throughout this, especially the Parashat Vayetchanan, it says, if you will try to keep my commandment, I will bless you. Well, here we have this interesting situation where Isaiah says God doesn't need it. How come God doesn't need it? What is happening? The answer here is in history. The book of Isaiah is written, especially this chapter, is written during the time of Uzziah. Uzziah was a very contradictory figure. On the one hand, it says in the book of Kings that he cleaned up the acts of his ancestors and he was doing the right things before the Lord. But it says the worship in the high places was not canceled. We talked about in this problem in the previous parashat. When people of Israel have appointed the king, they basically created a second in command after God, who now, being a human, was responsible for God's actions. If in the time of the sanctuary, God intervened in many unjust actions and would take the life of the Levites who did wrong in the eyes of the Lord, now it was the prerogative of king to watch and execute the judgment. So even though Uzziah by himself acted in the ways of the Lord, but the worship in the high places was conducted. And that's what was happening. People were going to the temple, and people were going to the high places, and God says, after you come and you did your iniquity, I don't want to have a solemn assembly after the iniquity was done first. This was the situation. This is one of the reasons which led to the destruction of the temple. The idolatry was in the root of all. But in case of the second temple, does this really work? And that's the big problem. Because there are two views on this matter. We definitely have the fact that no idolatry was performed at the first century CE. Pharisees and even Sadducees and Essenes, all these different religious parties, they were fighting over some issues of their interpretation of halakha, but nobody has even attempted to do an idolatry. Even though the priests in the temple were Sadducees, and they were in favor of Hellenization, but nevertheless, it was still not even close to the point of the adultery. And that's why there is no clear answer among the rabbis what actually has happened. Even though some Orthodox rabbis say that this was not sufficient dedication, which was partially truth maybe, but still there was no clear answer, especially when you look at the Midrashim and the Talmudic stories that try to explain the reason. On the other hand, there are certain Christian groups and Christian theologians that say that the temple, the second temple, was destroyed because Jews rejected Jesus. That is absolutely unacceptable. And the main reason for its unacceptability is the fact what would happen if the Jews would accept Jesus. Does this mean that the temple would exist? From the point of view of the Christian theology, this makes absolutely no sense, because Jesus is the end of the temple service. He, by his sacrifice, puts the end to all the rituals that were types of his sacrificial death. How can this possibly be that the Jesus' coming to earth would prolong the existence of the temple? What would the sacrifice mean, and how the high priest would work? This is why Jesus himself explains what is happening with the temple. In the book of Matthew, which we suggest for you to read as a complement to Haftarah and Parasha, in chapter 24, Jesus says, when the disciples show him the temple and came up to the point out of the temple and the buildings to him, he said to them, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. That was a shock. It's a big discussion today among some circles whether these prophecies have come to fulfillment. And some of the Jewish leaders point out to the Wailing Wall and say, look, this didn't come to a fulfillment. But the Wailing Wall was not actually the part of the sanctuary. It was a retaining wall that was holding up the big platform, the platform which was basically made out of the dirt to create, to merge two hills, the Moriah and Zion, to create sufficient place for the construction of the temple. So this was not a part of the temple. What is happening here? Definitely we know that the temple service came to abolition, not because God has punished the Jews for rejecting Jesus, but because when Jesus died and offered himself as a sacrifice, the temple service and even the Passover lamb, which was to be brought on that altar on the same time, wasn't needed. This is why Matthew describes at the very end of his gospel how the curtain which separates the holy from the Holy of Holies was torn apart, showing the end of the typical service, the service which was symbolic. But for the disciples back then, before that, the death of Jesus, these words were shock. They come to him and ask, tell us when this thing happened and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of age. Jesus immediately realizes how they connect his words. In the eyes of every Jew, the destruction of the temple was the end of the world. And Jesus starts encouraging his disciples, telling them, look, this is what's going to happen after the destruction of the temple. The false messiahs will come and that's not the end. And then there will be wars and the war rumors, and that is not the end. And there will be an earthquakes and famines and pestilence, and that is not the end. Jesus basically explains to his followers that the destruction of the temple is actually not an act of a punishment or the end of the world. It's the new stage of the mission which God gives to his people. And that's why he ends his discussion and his explanation with verse 14, saying, this gospel of kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nation, and then the end will come. This is not the end of the world, Jesus says. The gospel must go forward. Of course, he warns his followers and whoever listens to him that there may be some issues. Particularly, he warns his followers about the Roman troops who come and take over the city. It wasn't God who actually provoked zealots to have this rebellion. It wasn't God who brought the Roman troops into Israel, into the Judea. There was no word about this in the gospel, that God is going to punish somebody for rejecting Jesus and punish them by destroying the temple. Of course, people who don't listen to the word of Jesus, they suffer, because Jesus warned his followers, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by the armies and then recognize that her destruction is near, go away. He warns all the people, regardless of who follows him and who doesn't follow. But he gives the prophecy of warning and instruction how to survive these difficult times. Throughout the entire New Testament, we see the attempt of the different disciples of Jesus to encourage the Jewish people about the destruction of the temple, and to prevent people going into a depression with regards to that. This is why John, after the destruction of the temple, on the island of Patmos, looks up to heaven when he hears the voice calling upon him and sees the temple in heaven. The temple which stands today, and the temple that never been destroyed and will never be destroyed.